Good afternoon. Welcome to the Student Faculty Seminar of the President's Lecture Series and the Philosophy Forum. Before I introduce our speaker, there's an announcement. George Shialaba, who was to be here on November 13th, had to cancel his trip to Missoula. It's been rescheduled to March 12th of next year, and there will be information on the President's Office website and the media on the particulars. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ronald Grigor Suny. He is Distinguished University Professor of History and Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan. And he also has an appointment at the Institution of Higher Learning in St. Petersburg, Russia. He has widely published on Russia, the Soviet Union, and the Armenian genocide. This evening, he will talk about Lessons of October, the fate of democracy and socialism in the age of revolution and counter-revolution. And this will be in the University Center ballroom. His topic this afternoon is Koba, the young Stalin, the making of a revolutionary. Please join me in welcoming Professor Suny.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming on this rather dreary day. I was told that I haven't really seen Missoula yet because of the weather, so I have to come back next summer. So maybe I'll meet some of you then. We'll see. I want to talk this morning or this afternoon about making a Bolshevik, making a revolutionary. Or I sometimes call this talk Becoming Stalin. Let me begin with a quote from Dmitry Volkogonov, who was in fact a Soviet general, but later a biographer of Stalin. He wrote the following: "No one can be regarded as a born criminal. One cannot look at Stalin in the same light in 1918, in 1924, or in 1937. It's the same person, and yet it's not. In the 10 years after he succeeded Lenin, he changed markedly. Yet that's the difficulty of creating his political portrait. While apparently struggling for the ideals of socialism, however twistedly understood, he committed crime after crime," unquote. And I want to also preface the talk with a warning from a Russian proverb. Do not expect more from the truth than it actually contains. In the spring of 1924, Stalin's nemesis and rival, Lev Trotsky, told the old Bolshevik Vladimir Smirnov, "Stalin will become dictator of the USSR." "Stalin?" Smirnov reacted. "But he's a mediocrity. He's a colorless non-entity." "Mediocrity, yes," Trotsky mused. "Non-entity, no. The dialectics of history have already hooked him and will raise him up. He's needed by all of them, by the tired radicals, by the bureaucrats, by the nepmen, the kulaks, the upstarts, the sneaks, by all the worms that are crawling out of the upturned soil of the manured revolution," unquote. Trotsky certainly had a way with words. Now, I promise you that I'm not going to read this 84-page paper that I have here. We wouldn't have enough time, and you'll have to have dinner later as well. But I want to mention that I'm writing a biography. I've written, actually, the biography, and Princeton University Press has sent me a contract now, and it will be called something like Stalin from Koba to Commissar. Well, I won't get all the way to Commissar, that is October 1917, when the biography ends, but I will talk about his early life, and maybe we'll gain some understanding. We can then talk in discussion about what Stalin became. Because really, this is a figure that continues to fascinate. You know, Stalin is, after all, the central mystery within the riddle, inside the enigma that was the Soviet Union. And toward the end of his life, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, he was arguably the most powerful individual in the world. Yet, at various earlier times, he was seen as a gray blur. He was seen as the man who missed the revolution. He was, in this quote I read, a mediocrity hooked by history, as well as the marvelous Georgian. That's what Lenin called him. Generalissimo during World War II, and history's villain. If you Google Stalin biography, you'll get almost 200,000 websites. Amazon offers over 8,000 titles with Stalin's name in it, many of which qualify as biographies, whole or partial. And on average, something like 2 biographies appear somewhere every year, the latest by Stephen Kotkin of Princeton, a huge 1,100-page volume, which I'm halfway through, and I have to write a review for the Washington Post. So, as my mother said, who needs another biography of Stalin? What is it that you need to know that you don't already know, and what isn't already available? Well, first of all, the telling of Stalin's biography, of his life story, is more than simply biography. You know, there's a kind of wonder, first of all, at the achievement. Here's the son of a Georgian cobbler ascending the heights of world power, the architect of an industrial revolution, and the destruction, of course, of millions of people he ruled, the leader of a state that stopped the bloody expansion of fascism. Stalin's story is the making of the Soviet Union, and it's a story of a particular vision of what he called, and many liberals and conservatives in the West call, socialism. Now, his biographers, I found out as I was doing this work, and by the way, I started it 30 years ago. Some of you weren't even alive. His biographers have often placed historical imagination, even fiction, at the service of the specific politics of eroding or maybe even lauding the Stalinist heritage. Such a life story cannot, in fact, be separated from the evaluation of that life's work, and you have to include in it, if you really go through it, the drama, its achievements, its tragedies, its moral and emotional sides, because you're really writing about the major enemy through the Cold War and even up to the present of the country we live in, of the United States. So, understandably, the biography of Stalin has stimulated a lot of speculation and invention, as much as that, as real research. So how can we begin to grapple with this Stalin? Well, he's a very tempting figure. But at the same time, he was, as I discovered to my regret, one of the least hospitable subjects for a biographer. He wasn't particularly introspective. He didn't talk a lot about himself. He left no intimate letters, a few to his wife, a few to his mother. They don't tell you much. There's no secret diary, though someone once wrote one, and few witnesses to his inner life. Moreover, Bolshevik political culture was hostile to open personal explanations or expressions, and it imposed on Stalin and his other comrades an enforced modesty, as an idea that you shouldn't praise yourself. But of course, at the same time, he was the architect and the subject of a huge cult of personality, right? Grandiose mythologies about himself. Well, denial of the self, of the importance of the self, was part of the social democratic tradition. And even as that grotesque cult of Stalin grew, Stalin would continue disingenuously to claim that, oh, I dislike all the fuss. Stalin, like many or maybe most great politicians, was an actor. He postured. He play acted. I don't have to tell people in this audience about that. He stands revealed it seems to me, through what he did and what he did say in public. And now that the archives are open and there are witnesses that have come forth, we find some tidbits of private information as well. So here's this exceptional figure, this individual. But he's exceptional, in my view, because of what he became and what he did, the positions he occupied in this tumultuous time of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and early 50s. But I would argue that, like most people in higher politics, he was at the same time quite ordinary, a small man placed in extraordinary circumstances. Well, what I set out to do was shine some light on the most obscure and elusive years of Stalin's life, that is, the more than half he lived before the revolution, before he was Stalin even. And here you will meet another problem, the fascinating interest we have with that demon dictator of the 1930s is matched by an irresistible temptation to make his childhood and youth useful by investing them with the first signs of the mature ruler of the Soviet Union. Reading history backward, in other words. So if we have this arch criminal who oversaw the death of millions, there must have been something in his childhood that would explain this, kind of Freudian prejudice, you might say. Now, the accounts we have of his childhood are less crude than those on which some of us cut our historical teeth and which I loved reading as a little boy. There was a series called the Landmark series. They're probably gone by now. But as you read these stories, the first chapters of the various lives of great men and women already previsioned what they would become. So the ones I read were, for instance, Christopher Columbus, boy explorer. This is a kid who would sort of lose his way around the streets of Genoa and find his way home somehow. Or, of course, for females, Florence Nightingale, girl nurse. These are real books, by the way. And she went around patching up her friends, right? My favorite, I was from Philadelphia, was John Wanamaker, boy merchant. This little creep sold his used toys to his friends for a profit. Maybe we should get that book back now. That would be a good one. Anyway, but those who know the autocratic Stalin of totalitarian Russia then read back the characteristics of the general secretary, emphasizing what fits: violence, paranoia, arrogance, the need to dominate. And they reject what doesn't fit: romanticism, literary sensibility. This guy was a poet. Singing. He apparently had a beautiful voice and was known as Bulbuli, the nightingale, when he was in school. Love for his homeland. This internationalist revolutionary was originally a Georgian nationalist, and even revolutionary idealism. So we want to look at his early life. We want to sort of see where that personality arises, but we also want to be clear that what he became was not what he always was, that life was an evolution with swingbacks and movers forward, and we have to see what we can find to try to explain what ultimately he became. One of the earliest things that people did was try to conclude that there were psychological, maybe even physical blows suffered by the young Yosef Jugashvili, that was his name, Yosef Jugashvili, in his youth, that later made him the tough guy that he was. There's even one book which argues he used a lot of foot and kicking metaphors, and that was because he was kicked around as a kid. Well, that makes no sense to me, but there is such a book. His boyhood friend, Yosef Eremashvili, another Soso is the diminutive for Yosef, and who later became a Menshevik, that is a political opponent of Stalin, composed the very first memoir of Stalin's childhood. They were boyhood friends in the Georgian town, small city of Gori. And he made the primary psychological deduction that every other biographer has followed. And he goes something like this, quote, Undeserved, terrible beatings made the boy as hard and heartless as his father himself. Since all men who had authority over others, either through power or age, reminded him of his father, there soon arose a feeling of revenge against all men who stood above him. From his youth, the realization of his thoughts of revenge became the goal toward which everything was aimed, unquote. There's the key, then, to understanding Stalin, the great purges, and everything else. When the popular German biographer Emil Ludwig, known for his interviews with the political celebrities of the interwar years, met with Stalin, one of the few interviews he ever gave, in the Kremlin, he indelicately broached this particular topic of parental abuse. "What pushed you into opposition?" asked Ludwig. "Perhaps the bad treatment by your parents," unquote. Stalin, however, did not take the bait. "No," he answered, "my parents were uneducated people, but they treated me not badly at all." When I actually did the investigation, what I found out that yes, his father may have been abusive, and he seemed to have hated his father in many ways. But the one who actually beat him was his mother, Keke, who in fact was the strong model or role model for what Stalin became. What I also wanted to do in this biography, and I'll get to some of Stalin in a moment, just giving you some background, is look at the environment in which he grew up and see what could be induced from that environment. Because Stalin's story is ultimately the story, in part at least, of a larger context of empires and nations. That is, new forms of imperial construction and national ambitions. He was born and raised, don't forget, as you probably know, in Georgia. And Georgia was the first cultural environment he experienced. So he was born in the periphery of a periphery, the periphery being the Caucasus and Georgia, part of that periphery. But it's actually hard to claim that Djugashvili, who became Stalin, was a typical Georgian. And is there a typical Georgian? Are we supposed to somehow argue that Stalin, because of this violent and complex area in which he lived with ethnic and class conflict and oppression by the Tsarist Empire, in fact, made Georgians a certain type? Are we supposed to deduce from something called national character? Well, most anthropologists and others have dismissed such notions, such essentialist notions that somehow there's something fixed in Georgia. So what I tried to do in my own reading, and by the way, I spent years learning the Georgian language. I urge you not to do that, unless you want to spend a lot of time. Now, it's true that learning a language is good exercise for the brain. It's kind of push-ups for the brain. But this one will really wear you out, right? And it's very hard, and I've probably forgotten more Georgian than I ever knew. But I knew enough when I started in the 1970s to read Georgian well and talk to people and, in fact, find sources in the archives. But let's think about that Georgia in which he grew up, right? He's born in December 1878. The official date was 1879, but he was born a year earlier. His boyhood country was actually a lively arena in which people were defining and redefining and defending what they thought was their culture and its values. And they were often bitterly disagreeing with other members of the same ethnicity about what Georgia was. Who's a real Georgian? What is a Georgian Katsi, a man? And how should he act? These were real debates. And in fact, anthropologists now don't see so much cultures as, billiard balls discreetly placed on some green canvas, all discrete and nice and firm, with firm boundaries around them and harmony within. But rather, they see them as contested arenas with blurred boundaries and cultures moving and changing over time and being defined and redefined. You might think of a culture as an area which my friend Bill Sewell calls thin coherence, which is constantly a contest or discussion about what it is to be this or that nationality, right? Even American or Russian. I'm Armenian. I mean, I'm born in Philadelphia, but background Armenia. And I'm always being told, you're not a real Armenian. You had to learn Armenian. You didn't, in graduate school, you didn't learn it at home. You speak with an accent. You don't go to the church, this and that, and so you're not authentic. And so there's always these, you might call them ethnic policemen at the boundaries telling you who's in and who's out. You're not a real Jew, and so forth, right? And so Georgia was also like this. Nationalists were there. They were thinking about ethnic culture. They were trying to say it's harmonious and consistent. And those inside the culture shared characteristics that were true, authentic, harmonious with one another, and different from those others outside who were, of course, Armenian or Russian, and therefore foreign. But Georgia, in fact, was not only Georgian. Not only were people in his own lifetime defining and learning what it meant to be Georgian, in fact, there were organizations set up to teach people the Georgian language because it was being lost. It's nationalists, in a way, who create this sense of nation and nationalism, not the other way around. But in fact, Georgia was part of a larger Caucasian culture, with Armenians being of another church, and Muslim Azerbaijanis eventually, and mountain peoples. And all these things were going on to define who's who and what is what. So Georgian culture, like other cultures, was a field of play in which at one and the same time, values and behaviors were both shared, or believed to be shared, and contested. And new influences were contending with old traditions. And coherence and contradiction, divisions of power and status, gender roles, hierarchies were being defined and redefined. And I would argue that Stalin's ethnic culture may have been rather pervasive in his upbringing, but we've got to be clear what we mean, but it was also osmotic. Yet aspects of it were at the same time breaking down and being reformulated, while new intellectual attention was paid to what was thought to be about to be lost. Now, in rapid succession, Stalin, the young Jugashvili, moved from this small town, Gori, where his first university were the streets of Gori, where he lived with his mother, who he was close to, and his father, from whom he was quite alienated. And he engaged with other small kids. He liked to wrestle. He liked to fight, sometimes unfairly fight. We can see that in things. He was very good in school. As I mentioned, he wrote poetry, and he had a beautiful voice and sang in the chorus. And in that little school and in Gori, he imbibed the values of his mother, Keke, which were highly religious. And the memoirs of that period in Gori show that he was very, very observant in the Georgian Orthodox religion, that he felt very strongly identity with that religion, and this was the essence of what it was to be Georgian, and he seemed to have loved the language as well. He wrote poems in that language. But in rapid succession, this young Jugashvili would leave this largely Georgian town of his birth, and he would enter and move to a seminary. His mother sent him to a seminary. She wanted him to be a priest. Well, he became a priest in a kind of way, but she always regretted that he never was a priest. Even late in his life, her life, she said, when he would tell him, well, you know, I'm a kind of czar now of this whole Soviet Union. And she would say, oh, so, I regret that you never became a priest. And he loved that story and used to tell that story. And he moved to Tbilisi, to Tiflis, the capital of the Caucasus. And there, in that place, he would, in fact, was all involved in a much more cosmopolitan scene, meeting other nationalities, people of other nationalities, and a much more rough and tumble life without the protections of family and close friends. He went through the seminary, which was a defining experience in his life. The Tiflis Seminary, particularly, was a seminary that was, of course, organized to make priests for the Orthodox Church. This seminary failed in that particular area and produced more revolutionaries than they did priests. And part of the reason was that as Stalin came into that seminary, the rules of the game had changed. The seminary was being Russified, and the Georgian language was being eliminated. And so some of his earliest struggles were about what can we do in Georgian. It seems we can only study our own religion in Georgian and have some church singing in Georgian, and everything else is being taught in this foreign language, namely Russian. And the priests in that school were either Russians or Russified Georgians who hated their own native culture, right? And all of these things are talked about as the students themselves are protecting their own culture, fighting against this Russification, trying to learn different things. So this was the next culture that Stalin was going to be raised in, the seminary with its counter-education, which was going on at the same time. Because what the students did in that seminary were form their own reading circles, kruzhki in Russian, little circles. And in those little circles, they would read the works of revolutionaries, of Russian literature, right? So if you're reading Pushkin and Tolstoy and Turgenev and so forth, you're reading stories with deep humanism and implicit criticism of autocracy, capitalism, exploitation, etc. This is a very humanistic literature. It's a world literature. And they would read stories by Georgians as well, like the famous story by Kazbeki, Alexander Kazbeki, of a hero, of a bandit hero named Koba, K-O-B-A, Koba, who was an avenger against crimes committed by Russians and Russified Georgians against innocent mountaineer people, right? And Stalin so loved this story that he took the name Koba as his revolutionary pseudonym, his klitschka, his revolutionary nom de guerre, and he would be called Koba until the end of his life by his closest friends. Or in the case of someone like Bukharin, a former friend who he was about to execute, in his last years, Bukharin wrote these letters, "Dear Koba, Daragoy Koba," pleading for his life. And Stalin apparently put those letters in his drawer and kept them, and then had Bukharin shot. After the seminary, a place where he gives up religion, began to read subversive books like Victor Hugo, Karl Marx. There were libraries in town where you could read these things. Some of the literature of the populists, of the Narodniki, the peasant revolutionaries. And along with that, not only Georgian literature, but also Darwin. And Darwin had an amazing effect because it undermined his original commitment to Orthodox Christianity as well. At least that's what we're told from many of these memoirs and from Stalin himself later in life. And so he went through the seminary. He then became and self-identified as a member of a particular Russian sloy, a layer in Russian society, which we call the intelligentsia, or we use in English, intelligentsia. Now, the Russian intelligentsia is not simply intellectuals. There are people who are intellectual, who read and write and so forth, but they're also committed to opposition to the existing regime, and they're interested, as they put it, in serving the people. Right? And so he began to identify, though he's the son of a cobbler, a legacy that he's rejected, he sees himself as an intellectual. He always had this ambivalent or ambiguous identification, both with working people, someone who pulled himself up by, I don't mean this facetiously, by his own bootstraps, and became an intellectual, right? So he becomes a member of the intelligentsia with their own sense of mission, their own identification. He then joins a movement. There is in Georgia at this time the most radical, the most potent movement in the 1890s and 1900s is a Marxist movement, a movement of people who will eventually join the more moderate wing of the Social Democratic Party, the Mensheviks, led by a man named Noe Jordania. And that movement will become extraordinarily powerful in Georgia. Indeed, it will become the national liberation movement of Georgia. And from 1918 to 1921, until the Bolsheviks came and overthrew them, it was that movement, these Marxists, national Marxists, was the government of the independent Republic of Georgia, right? So, but he became a member of this movement, not a Menshevik though. He identified with the more radical wing, a small group of younger revolutionaries who eventually joined the more radical wing which was the Bolsheviks, led by, of course, Vladimir Lenin, right? So all of these different movements, the seminary, the intelligentsia, the movement, and then commitment to a particular faction of a particular social democratic Marxist party, all of these things, by his 21st birthday, when he became a professional revolutionary, an outlaw, leaving the seminary, not finishing there, he was now defined by these various cultures and by the political culture of Russian social democracy with its very specific forms of moral and personal behavior. Its idealized self-representations of what it meant to be a committed intelligent, a politically radical intellectual, and also by codes, elaborate codes of loyalty and sacrifice that one betrayed only at great risk. So already at that young age of 21, not much older than many of you in this room, he's gone outside the law into this movement and dedicated his life to it. And in that world, friends, comrades, people you could trust, fear of betrayal became extraordinarily important, right? So trust is important, and the trust and friendship also contains within it the opposite, which is betrayal and someone becoming an enemy. And when you read the actual documents and the few extant letters we have from Stalin, you see this discussion about who can be trusted. You see the development, what others later will call paranoia, suspicion of someone who is betraying them and even needs to be murdered, right? Because they have become enemies, informers, police agents, or whatever. All of those things shaping this new psychology that Stalin is developing. And then this biography, which I'm writing up to 1917, in some ways works against the conventional or usual biographical narrative. The usual biography has a kind of organic continuity between the child, the boy in this case, the young adult, and the mature man. And what I think I'm going to try to do, and somehow hold the story together, is accept the challenge that what I actually have are fragments, available fragments, of a life that actually suggests a far more disjointed evolution in which Stalin would shed one identity and take on another, in which older identities there'd be residues, but a series of different identities, palimpsests of older commitments. So this obedient child of this woman and mother he adored, the priest in training, who then becomes a rebel, the Georgian patriot, who becomes in many ways an assimilated Russian, though only in part and primarily in his public posture, the militant Bolshevik in his early youth, who in many ways later, before the revolution and certainly in the 1920s, becomes more moderate, centrist Bolshevik, only to turn again at the end of the 20s and into the 30s into the most radical of all Bolsheviks and becoming the murderer of the old Leninist elite. I'm going to try to argue in this biography, I think I've tried to do this, we'll see what my editor thinks, that he's moving physically and psychologically away from Georgia, leaving behind a culture in which one's own sense of personhood derived from family, friends, and nation. And he entered a world, a far more difficult world, in which one defined one's own nature, but in line with particular understandings given by Marxism of historical direction and the unforgiving imperatives of politics. The unforgiving imperatives of politics. What had to be done in order to take power, overthrow an old regime, and hold power. And through that evolution, I argue and I use the word empathy, he has an erosion of empathy. As he's living through, particularly in the events of 1905, 1906, a revolution in which he becomes a kind of outlaw, becomes even a terrorist, we would call him, and leads a small group of people who carry out murders and who carry out robberies, etc., he begins to lose the sense of kind of limits to what needs to be done in order to destroy those in power, those who have property, privilege, and wealth. And that will be only compounded as he goes repeatedly into exile, into prison, to Siberia, goes through the revolution, goes through the Civil War, and eventually emerges as the most powerful figure in the Bolshevik Party. And then he'll carry out his own rather vicious revolutions and purges, which he will both initiate, promote, in which he will fabricate false crimes against people he wants to destroy, until the year 1937, 1938. Imagine this. In the year 1937, 1938, 700 to 800,000 people in Russia, Soviet citizens and unfortunate foreign communists who find themselves there, will be executed by the Soviet government. 700 to 8,000 killed by their own government, right? It's a kind of genocidal crime. I don't call it genocide, but it's of that kind of magnitude. So much done, so many things done, that the state will be weakened, the party will be weakened, and the army will be weakened on the eve of World War II. Right? So these are the kinds of things that he actually carried out, responding to his own inner needs, whatever he now was possible, and he was certainly an autocrat by that time, deeply changed by these experiences that he had gone through, seminary, underground, prison, revolution, Civil War, and the holding of absolute power, so that by the time Stalin emerges on the world scene in the 1930s, I'm arguing he is the product of these successive cultures through which he passed, and also an actor making choices and defining himself in unprecedented and unpredictable historical circumstances. That's the story I want to tell. And I want to tell, I will, before I finish this opening thing, and I can talk about detail and anything you would like to talk about in the question period, I want to just tell you one thing about his Georgianness and how it changes into his Russianness, how he discards this Georgianness and why he moves in another direction. And the irony is that he joins this Marxist movement. So among young people at the very turn of the century, as he's leaving the seminary and dedicating himself to the revolutionary movement, Soso Djugashvili, who is now called Koba, and later after 1913 would be called Stalin, Man of Steel, this young revolutionary is, like others of his generation, identifies with these older Marxists who are reading Georgian history, like Jordania, and writing it in a new Marxist framing. Why Marxism? Why Marxism, of all things, in Russia, which is a country of 85% peasants? And Georgia is even more underdeveloped. There's hardly a proletariat. Marxism is, after all, a point of view that a revolution will develop as as capitalism reaches its maturity, and all its innate contradictions will lead to the formation of an active revolutionary subject, an agent, the working class, the proletariat, that will gain consciousness, overthrow that system, and begin the march towards socialism and eventually communism. That's a one-sentence, cheap definition of Marxism, right? That's all I have time for today. Sorry about that. If you want to talk about Marxism, I'm happy to talk about it. But why Georgia? Well, Marxism at the turn of the century in Europe was the most fashionable, the most progressive, and from Germany, the most massive intellectual radical movement in the country. And Marxism is extremely attractive. It told a story that Russia, even though it's backward and peasant, will pass through stages, become capitalist, and develop, and eventually have its own anti-autocratic and anti-capitalist revolution. And whereas it was very hard to organize peasants out there, these peasants would see these intellectuals come and think, Jesus Christ has come, or who is that? We have to turn him over to the police. The small working class in the cities of Petersburg or Moscow or Baku, in fact, listened to the message. They were in town, they were close to these intellectuals, and they bought this message that placed workers at the forefront of history as the agent that would in fact accomplish this revolution. And for Georgians, Marxism was particularly convenient, because what the Marxist message, as defined by Jordania, said was, we have two enemies. One is autocracy, and one is capitalism, the bourgeoisie. Now, Georgia was a society which was part of the Russian Empire, and autocracy was represented by Russians. And Georgia was a society in which capitalism and the bourgeoisie was largely Armenian. They were the middle class. They were the Jews of the Caucasus, right? And so if you were a nationalist, you were anti-Armenian, and you were maybe anti-Russian. But if you were a Marxist, you were not anti-Armenian or anti-Russian, you were anti-autocracy and anti-bourgeois. And so Marxism, in the way it was formulated by these early Georgian Marxists, was in fact a movement that talked about class struggle and political struggle, not ethno-national struggle. And so the Georgian national movement, the national liberation movement of Georgia, was Marxist and socialist rather than purely nationalist. It had national tinges to it, obviously. It appealed mostly to Georgians. But it was against those old-fashioned nationalists who were so Armenophobe and Russophobe. And this is the movement into which Stalin came. Fine. But Stalin did have this idea that the younger generation was more militant, more radical, more willing to take action than these Marxist intellectuals, these Georgians, most of them former or even actual noblemen, up at the top. And therefore there was a kind of antagonism between these poor, younger radicals and these Georgian Marxists. And in 1945, by that time, the young Stalin had become very enamored of a particular figure in the Marxist movement, namely Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. He was very taken by this book, 1902, that Lenin had written called Что делать, or What is to be done. And in What is to be done, Lenin gave an inordinate role to those professional revolutionaries, those social democrats, many of them intellectuals, some workers, who could bring the message of revolution to ordinary workers and convince ordinary workers that what their real goal was not a bigger greasy piece of the capitalist pie, higher wages and shorter hours, but the actual overthrow of autocracy and eventually of capitalism, and make a revolution, create socialism, and empower ordinary working people. And that message met this young intellectual who had raised himself up from the working class, Stalin, and that resonated in him. And when the party split between those Leninists or Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, Stalin joined immediately the Bolsheviks and the Leninists. But most Georgians and the Georgian socialist movement followed Jordania and the Mensheviks. It was the one place in the Russian Empire where Menshevism had mass following among workers, intellectuals, and peasants. It led a peasant movement in Western Georgia, very powerful. So Stalin was suddenly, because of his commitment to this minority wing in Georgia of the Bolsheviks, ended up alienated from the dominant movement in Georgia, his own Marxist movement. Well, he led a strike that ended in disaster in 1902 in Batumi on the Black Sea coast. He was pilloried for that. He went to jail for that. And when he escaped, he left Georgia and went to Baku, where there was really a large oil industry and where he joined a multinational movement there of social democrats, some Muslim, but mostly Armenian and Russian, some Georgian as well. And the rest of his career then is moving away from Georgia toward this internationalist movement, which of course housed and gave hospitality to Jews and Russians and Latvians and Armenians and any other nationality that came along. And so he moved into a kind of internationalist, cosmopolitan movement in which he would make his career outside of his homeland, outside of Georgia. And the final thing I'd say before I stop and we open a discussion is the importance of the events of 1905. Once again, this is a moment of colossal violence in Georgia. Now, Georgia was one of those places, because of this Marxist movement that developed in that country, and with its massive peasant movement and support for these Marxist intellectuals. This is, by the way, in my mind, the first place where Marxists led a peasant movement. Marxists were usually suspicious of peasants. They were backward. These are the people who put down the French revolutions in 1789, in 1848, and the Paris Commune. And so peasants were not the people you wanted to ally with necessarily. But the peasants in Georgia followed the Marxists. And it was so powerful in Georgia that whole parts of the country were run by these Marxists and by the peasants in Western Georgia. So that when the Tsarist regime in 1906 and 1907 came back, now reasserted its power, it did so with unbelievable brutality. There was what were called Karachimny expeditia, or punitive expeditions, in which these troops rode through the cities, burned villages through the countryside, burned villages, hanged peasants, and put down this massive movement. And it's in that atmosphere, in that environment, that Stalin learned about revolution, about violence, engaged in violence as well. Well, in the years after the put down of that revolution, he would go to Russia, he would work close with Lenin, and in 1913 he would go to Siberia, and would end up the last 4 years of the Tsarist period, from 1913 until he was liberated by the February Revolution of 1917, 100 years ago. He would be in Siberia. And then from there, he would suddenly be transformed, transported and transformed into an important revolutionary and eventually a commissar in the Bolshevik government that came to power in October-November 1917. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I thank you for your attention, and I hope you have questions or anything. I'm willing to talk about whatever you like. I saw you first, and then you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, Dr. Suny, I have two questions that are very short and related to each other. First of all, I believe this came from General Koba. I'm not totally sure. I wondered if you've seen it. Allegedly, Stalin had a thick Georgian accent and always spoke softly before crowd.
True.
Okay, and secondly, this showed his defensiveness of not being a Russian as a leader of the Soviet Union.
That's a harder one. That is, did he feel defensive about being the leader of the Soviet Union because he wasn't Russian? The interesting thing about the Bolsheviks were, yes, it's true that Russians, they operated in Russian language and so forth, but it was a multinational party. And the leaders of that revolution, if you think about the people around Lenin, how Russian was Lenin, by the way? Lenin was Russian, but this is an imperial nationality. He had Tatar blood, Jewish blood, a little German blood, a little of this, a little of that, right? And nationalists and anti-Bolsheviks would say, he's not really a Russian. Look, he is actually a Jew or something like that, right? But then Trotsky was Jewish, Kamenev was Jewish, Zinoviev was Jewish, Dzerzhinsky was a Pole, the head of the secret police, and you could go on and on. You know, Khrushchev was a Russian, but from Ukraine, et cetera, right? Right? Yeah. Who did you mention? Dimitrov was Bulgarian. Rakovsky was, I think, also Bulgarian. I would stop for that for a moment. But Yanukidze was Georgian, or Janukidze was a Georgian. So it was a multinational leadership. There was no great value placed on being ethnically Russian. It was rather your own convictions and your place. Now, there were disadvantages if you were a Jew, because you had a deep-seated kind of anti-Semitism in the population. So Trotsky, for instance, when he was appointed People's Commissar of Foreign Affairs, said, well, but I'm Jewish. And Lenin said, it's not important, it's not important. So they did that. But later, that would become a liability. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
If a publisher wanted to sell a lot of copies and decided to call your book The Banality of Koba, what objections would you have?
Why banality, though? I would want to call it that, you know.
Well, your understanding of Stalin can be taken as showing him as an ordinary person
Yeah.
whose circumstances turned into a monster.
That's a good point, and that's the Trotsky quote that I started with. You're right, yeah. No, I would say I have a kind of view of political power in places like Russia or the United States that almost anyone can succeed under certain conditions. And currently we understand how that's possible, it seems to me, in this country, and also in Russia, right? Think about it, Putin. How did Putin ever get to power? Putin was a policeman and didn't have a great charismatic personality, but he was very capable and competent, and ultimately someone, Yeltsin, picked him out and hooked him and raised him up, and he turned out to be extraordinarily competent in certain ways, able to unify the country, become extraordinarily popular, and so forth, right? And in the United States, I mean, if you go through the list of presidents, you know, it's very odd who became and who didn't become and who failed. We don't somehow choose necessarily the most competent, the most brilliant person. We choose the one who happens under the conditions of that political system to emerge, right? So I would say for political leaders, it's that they're put in extraordinary positions. And then we see, like Abraham Lincoln was put in an extraordinary position. The country fell apart. He decided, I'm not going to allow the South to secede. They want to secede. They want to make their own nation. No, we're going to use colossal violence in order to keep them as part of this country. And he succeeded and then was murdered, right? So it's the circumstances that took, in that case, a very talented person, maybe the right person for that moment, to win that war and become who he became. Yeah, I see so many points. Let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay? Go ahead. Remember your order.
Let me ask my question and then tell you where it comes from so that it has some grounding. And thank you for that presentation, by the way. To what extent did Stalin draw on Marx's writings to legitimate his political and economic ideology? The question comes out of Hammond, a former University of Montana history professor, in his book, The Red 48ers, who argues, I think convincingly, that you can forget the 1844 manuscripts and trying to humanize Marx, that by the time you get to Marx teaming up with Engels, the humanism is long gone, and the focus on revolution at all costs is dominant. So then the original question being, to what extent does Stalin actually draw on Marx and Engels for his political ideology?
It's an excellent question, and it's a complex answer, but I'll try to give it to you. So Marxism is a secular humanism. That is, and even if you, these guys did not know the early Marx. Those manuscripts, 1844 manuscripts and so forth, the German ideology, only is discovered and published during Soviet times. So they didn't know that Marx. But they did know the Communist Manifesto, and they knew Capital, and they knew the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, and so forth and so on. And so they could read what his message was to them, right? And if you read the Communist Manifesto, and my students, my freshmen are reading it this weekend, I'll see what they think, right? In the age of Bernie Sanders, what they think of this particular manuscript, if they understand it. It's there about overcoming the limits of human possibility. And the Communist Manifesto is a grandiose, as is Capital, in some ways paean to capitalism. It argues that capitalism is the most amazing, the most productive system ever conceived in human history. Marx is primarily a sociologist, historian of capitalism. But, he says, it is a system that holds people down. It may make them more wealthy, but it doesn't realize full human potential. And that can only be in a system where we transcend capitalism and begin to think of the whole human being, right? And then they sort of cogitate and and fantasize about how that could happen. So what about someone like Stalin? Stalin took Marx, and particularly Lenin and Engels' view on Marx, very seriously. I would say for Stalin, Marxism was his sociology. It was his worldview. It was the way he understood the world. But he was also a pragmatic and often opportunistic politician who had his own personal preferences. And therefore he read Marx and used Marx often instrumentally. And we have examples where he would annotate Marx and say, ha, impossible. What is he thinking? Things like that. So he wasn't that, as you could say, he wasn't that dogmatic about Marx. But he believed in class struggle. He talked about and used, maybe instrumentally, but maybe really believed it, capitalist encirclement, things like that, right? Did he really believe in the ultimate goals of Marx, and that is the empowerment of the working class, of those kinds of things that you find in Lenin and, say, State and Revolution? No, they didn't move in that direction at all. He went a different direction. He created autocracy. He said in 1936, we have created socialism. Socialism in 1936 in Russia, when you have a despotism and you're about to murder thousands of people? Is that what socialism was about? Is that what Marx was about? So he has transformed it. And of course, that vision of socialism as Stalinism and socialism, which by the way Stephen Kotkin buys in his book, has been very convenient mostly, not for communists, but for liberals and conservatives. Because if that's socialism, who wants that, right? So that's a nice equation there, but we're going to reject that and not talk about Trotsky's critique or social democracy or Sweden or Marxist intellectuals in the West who have other visions. Who's next? Yeah, young man.
I wanted to ask, as you trace the trajectory in the thesis you mentioned for your book from sort of away from an ethnic communitarian identity in Georgia toward sort of an ideological community, away from ethnic toward ideological, do you think the rise of like ethnic supremacism outside of Russia had anything to do with that? So outside of the scope of your book, how did Stalin respond to fashionable race science and the rise of Nazi ideology informing that trajectory?
Yeah, these are very good questions. So Marxism is anti-nationalist, right? It is against nationalism. It considers it bourgeois ideology. It's a stage of history. It can be overcome. And who should become the Bolsheviks' theorist of nationality and nationalism but Stalin? And he writes this famous pamphlet in 1913, which is Lenin encouraged him to do. And he has a very simple view of nationality. He really has a kind of materialist idea that nationality and ethnic nationality is created by a certain stage of history, by capitalism, by the bourgeoisie, etc., and will be overcome eventually, right? Though as he goes on in the 30s and all, he begins to give up this idea that it will be overcome. There will always be different languages groups. There will always be some, and he continues that idea. So he changes his view. How did they react to this? First of all, they were never racists. They did not believe in biological essence of the nation, right? Except, let me say this, in the 1930s, as they begin to define nationality, they move progressively away from the idea that nationality, as Marxists might have it, is a historical cultural construction, to an idea that somehow it's fixed deeply in experience and culture, so that your nationality is then defined officially in law by who your parents were. So it's mostly it's partly biological. If both parents are Russian, you have no choice, you're a Russian, and that will be on your passport. If one parent is Armenian and one is Georgian, you can choose which one you want to be, usually Armenian because the father is Armenian, or Georgian if the father's Armenian, right? And the name would be like that. So it's partly constructed and a choice and partly biological, right? They also did in the 20s experiment with ideas of eugenics. That was later rejected, right? Because the Nazis were now moving in that way. The Soviet Union was a great enemy of anti-Semitism. That will sound strange to many people. In the 1920s and 1930s, they were the first country that made laws against anti-Semitism and so on. They promoted Yiddish and Jewish culture up to 1939. And then, of course, it changes with the Nazi-Soviet pact. And after World War II, Stalin became increasingly anti-Semitic, and there were actual purges of Jews late in his life, right? So these things change over time. I'm not sure. Did I get to your answer?
No,
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what I wanted to know.
Okay.
From ethnic to ideological.
Yeah.
PC.
One of the things I most spent my career on was talking about nationality policy in the Soviet Union. Now, the general orthodox view during the Cold War, which I first met, was that the Soviet Union was repressive, it was Russification, it was the dissolving of nationality. It was about internationalism or Sovietism. And what you discovered when you went there was, oh no, Georgians are really Georgian and Armenians are being, and there's encouragement of these local cultures in most of the places. And there was even the creation of nations. Uzbeks had never existed as a nation until the Soviet times, or Tajiks or whatever. And so I began to examine Leninist nationality policy, which was to embed and encourage these nationalities with their own educational systems, their own culture, their movie houses, all of these things, cadres, officials in those local cultures as well. All of that began to develop in the Soviet period, and Stalin never stopped that. But in the 30s, he moved away from Lenin and began to encourage learning of Russian language, the primacy of Russians, etc., and the development of a Soviet identity, which was largely Russia. So you have to look at this as an evolutionary history. Going along, yeah.
You started to touch on it, but I just wanted to hear a little more about what you disagree about in the Kotkin biography.
The main thing, I wrote a review of the first volume and was critical because he didn't spend much time on the early period. But I was actually glad because that leaves me a place to get in there, right? And to write my book and maybe sell a few copies. Though mine is a different kind of book. His is written for a more popular audience, and mine is, I think, in some ways more scholarly because it's based on archives, et cetera, in a very intimate way. But what I most object to is, and this is a political judgment, is his close identification repeatedly of Stalinism with socialism. So he says, what they built in the Soviet Union was socialism. Socialism was supposed to be non-capitalism tout court. You know, just that's it, this is it. Did I say that right in French? Yeah? So it's absolutely, and this is what they built. And of course, I think that's wrong. I think socialism is like liberalism or conservatism. There are all kinds of meanings that it could mean. Different people have different understandings. But that was the Stalinist definition. The book concentrates, the second volume, it's 900 pages of text, followed by 200 pages of notes in 8-point font. I can hardly read it. So there's a lot to read yet, but I'm about page 550, so I'm more than halfway through it. And it's heavily about the purges. Well, you know, whatever lens you take will emphasize certain things and de-emphasize other things. So the whole Soviet experience begins to look like what it was in the 1930s, particularly 1937, 1930, mass murder, you know, of largely communists, but also innocent other people as well. So I would have given it a different orientation probably, but he's telling a fascinating story. Yeah.
So this is just for my own historical lacuna. In the 1890s up to 1905, could you clarify what the Russian intelligentsia and/or workers that comprise the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks mean by Marxist social democracy? What did that term social democracy mean to them at that time?
Social democracy was the term used from, let's say, the 1870s on for the Marxist labor movements and the political parties. And the biggest party was the German Social Democratic Party. And that was the model for everybody else. Engels, Kautsky, Babel, all of these people, August Babel, all of those people, Ebert. And that was the major movement. And ultimately, it was a movement that won parliamentary plurality and even majority, I believe, by World War I. Right? And so the Russian Social Democratic Party was formed in 1898. It called itself the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. And other parties developed. And so Marxists that's what social democracy was. Marxism, labor movement, and that party. That's what it meant. The word, and they called themselves socialists, social democrats. When World War I broke out, and the majority of socialist parties, including the majority of the German party, supported the war, people like Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and some of these very left social democrats were appalled that they had gone this sort of nationalist route, patriotic route. And Lenin, which is an extraordinary thing, was what we call a defeatist. Imagine, he called for the defeat of his own country in a world war. Imagine that. I can imagine it because I remember the 60s when many of us were hoping for the defeat of certain countries against the Vietnamese. Right? I won't mention any names. Nobody you know about anyway. Because you thought your country was wrong. Because you thought that what they were, and of course he hoped that the defeat of Russia, the bulwark of the system in Europe, would lead to international revolution. And so by 1918, they changed their name from Social Democrats to Communist, right? And then you have all these splits in the European socialist movement between the moderates, who are Social Democrats and believe in evolutionary socialism, not revolution, and the communists who follow the Leninist model and advocate revolution, and which was, of course, a disaster for socialism, this split. Someone over here yet? Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, I would like to commend you for your masterful overview of the whole revolutionary movement, starting way back, at least 100 or more years ago. And I just wanted a more personal type of question, because as a single biologist who taught here for many years, I wasn't aware of the importance of philosophical anarchism to the whole revolutionary history, and I just wondered, where I became familiar with that concept was when I read a very delightful book by Rudolf Rocker on the London years that he spent with East End tailors, and it just was a remarkable understanding. But the point is, it turns out this author of that book, Rudolf Rocker, has published fairly widely in the field of revolutionary socialism. And even as a simple young Catholic boy growing up in mines during the late 19th century, he was caught up in all of the movements at the time, and he became a commentator and an editor of books on anarchism. So I thought it'd be interesting to see if anyone else knew of this very interesting person, Rudolf Rocker, and I tried to talk to some of my colleagues in philosophy and in other social science subjects, and none of them seemed to be aware of this person's name. Now, I wonder if you have any knowledge of that name at all?
I don't. I'd love to know what the book is. Maybe we can talk afterwards and you can tell me. No, I don't. And in fact, anarchism was an important movement in Russia. And it was one which the Bolsheviks destroyed. That is, they didn't want, any opponents on the left. And so they're pretty rough with the anarchists. There are some very good books by a man named Paul Avrich, A-V-R-I-C-H, who was an American. He taught at Queens College. He was a professor. He was a wonderful man, died too young, who wrote books about Russian anarchism. And the best one of his books, I think, is one on the Kronstadt Revolt of 1921, when the Bolsheviks, so these local sailors, Bolshevik sailors in Kronstadt, who had supported the Bolsheviks, now begin to turn against the Bolsheviks because they're forming a dictatorship. And they call for Soviets without Bolsheviks, without communists.
We are from Kronstadt.
We are from Kronstadt, yeah. And that's a very important moment. And of course, the Bolsheviks don't let them do that. They crush them, right? So there's a lot of good literature on that stuff, yeah. I think we're going to go now to this part. Yeah, over here, this young man.
Yeah. So early on in the presentation, you were touching on more human traits that Stalin may have possessed, and one of the ones you mentioned was romanticism. So considering that, could you touch on any serious romantic relationships that Stalin may have had that influenced his formation as a revolutionary or dictator, or if that wasn't a significant part of it?
So if you really want to know about his lovers, then you should read a book called Young Stalin by Simon Sebag Montefiore. Anytime Stalin met a woman or touched her hand or whatever, he had an affair with her. That's what, I went through all of this evidence, and it's hard to say. But he did have some relationships, right? Stalin married in 1907 a young Georgian woman, very dedicated to Stalin, and she had a child, Yakov, son, and died soon after. And apparently he was very hurt by this. You know, we have evidence from Iramashvili and others about how he was devastated. And then he has these various relationships in exile and in prison camps and so forth, short-term things, until the revolution. And there he stays in Petersburg, Petrograd now, when he came back from exile, with a family called Aliluyev, Sergei Aliluyev. And Sergei had a young daughter who was very young, a young teenager, named Nadyezhda. Nadyezhda, huh? Yeah, Nadia, and Aliluyeva. And eventually she became Stalin's secretary, and eventually he married her. And apparently he was dedicated to her. But he was Stalin, and he was a rough guy, and he was also cruel to her. And in 1932, there was a celebration on November 7th of the anniversary of the revolution, and Stalin apparently insulted her and threw something at her. And she left the party, and Molotov's wife tried to calm her down and so forth, and she went back to her apartment and she shot herself. So Stalin's young wife, Aliluyeva, committed suicide, and Stalin was devastated by this. And the stories are, and they're pretty well documented, that he would often go to Novodevichy Monastery graveyard and sit by her very, very beautiful tomb. There's a simple marble stele with a bust of a young woman, her very delicately done, right? One of the most beautiful pieces of sculpture in Russia, in fact. And he would refer to her every once in a while, or he would propose toasts to her. Shortly after she died, he very much liked or loved a young comrade who he had placed in Leningrad as the head of the party named Sergei Kirov. He really liked this man as a son, as a young comrade, and would often call him to Moscow and walk with him and so forth. And in December of 1934, Kirov was assassinated. Some people said Stalin did it. It's nonsense. It isn't Stalin. He was killed by a crazy guy. In 1934, he was assassinated. And Stalin rushed to Leningrad by train and immediately linked this killing to his enemies, Kamenev, Zinoviev, and eventually Trotsky, right? And that is the beginning of the cycle that leads to the Great Purges, right? Each year accelerating the number of people killed until they call a halt to it in 1938 after the execution of Bukharin. Yeah, I think I saw one here, and then we'll go back here. And you tell me when to stop. Yeah, go ahead.
As my colleague, what the presentation you did, a short presentation, they represent the best of the humanities, something which is under attack, serious attack here and a bit everywhere in America. So thank you. I have a quick comment and a quick question. From the features you described about the psychology, behavior, early life of Stalin, you could say, if you want to play amateur psychoanalyst, that Stalin is governed by, there's two poles. On the one side, it's like a split personality, a collage of contradiction, like the colonial subjectivity described by Frantz Fanon, right? Allegiance, resistance against a master discourse, a master language. Anyway, so someone very split, full of contradiction. The notes is away, but split, right? On the other hand, as you said, when he was ruthless, it's as if it's the discourse of the perverse in psychology. The perverse says, well, I'm the mere agent, the blind hand, instrument, agent of the big other, this big other being the revolution, which gives certain, it's called the structure of the perverse according to Freud. So would you agree that there is this play, if it's helpful in Stalin life, between the tendency to be split, quasi-schizoid, and then the perverse tendency? And my quick question following the young man there is, have you used I don't know if it's a biography of Svetlana's daughter, which was all over Europe and America. Did you look at it, or was it helpful?
On the second part, yes. I did look, and she's written several different things, and there's now a biography of her too. So there's a lot of material, and there's now a lot of material about the family and memoirs, and we actually translated from Georgian and published the memoir of his mother. And it's available, I think, almost for free on Amazon, of Stalin's mother. But I had written a big, long introduction to it, which came out in Russian and in English, but Amazon didn't publish that. But you can find the memoir. I tried, Michel, to stay away from psychoanalysis. Right? I don't feel capable of that, and no one has placed him on a couch or had those kinds of intimate interviews with it. Of course, you can't do a biography without psychology, right? So what I've tried to do, rather than deducing psychology from some model, either Freudian or, in the case of Robert Tucker, Horneyan, Karen Horney, or something like that, I've tried to induce it from what I know, what he reads, what he says, what people say about him. So I go the other way. But there is a theme, I think, in this biography, and I alluded to it a moment ago without elaborating, and that is the erosion of empathy. That is, through these various experiences, you know, the seminary, prison camp, exile, revolutionary violence, mistrust, the underground, whatever, he loses this thing which connects you and allows you to feel the pain of others, right? That word empathy is now in the news again, by the way. It was mentioned this morning when I was listening to NPR. So I remember that President Obama used the word empathy, and there was a huge attack on him. He said that someone who is appointed a judge should have empathy. There was a huge attack on him. And this morning, Ruth Marcus of the Washington Post, they were discussing Trump's inability to find the right words to tell Gold Star mothers and fathers about the loss of their soldiers, said that the president is empathy impaired, you know? Now, I would say that about Stalin. I would say that even that's too weak a characteristic. Because when you actually read through the Kotkin biography and you see what he's writing about people, how he's fabricating these crimes, how he's demanding torture, how he's demanding murder and executions, and making numbers that they have to be killed, you wonder, have we lost, I mean, is this a normal person in any sense? How can we relate to such a thing? The purges remain a mystery, right? And I say this in the review that I'm writing about this volume. Why did they do it? Why would a government turn against its own elite and murder tens of thousands of people, mostly in the elite, weaken its own state, weaken its army? He killed 3 out of the 5 Soviet marshals, including the most talented Mikhail Tukhachevsky, right? And weakening the state, and he knew that Hitler's in the wings waiting, and they expected war all through the 30s. And it's a great mystery. And Kotkin offers his own explanation, a mix of personal ambition and circumstances and the need to get rid of the old elite and create a new elite, etc. But still at the heart of it, a kind of mystery because of the dimensions. And there were other ways to do this more efficiently and less murderously, right, than what actually carried out. So I think that many people have done what you could call the hard work of gathering material, interpretation, and explanation, but at the end, there's an area which historians and maybe psychologists find difficult to enter, because these kinds of choices made by these kinds of leaders, right? People can, I don't know, maybe we need more understanding of the psychology of power, of what happens to someone who has that kind of power. Very kind people, like Obama. Obama is a humanistic guy, right? But he could carry out these drone warfares and excuse them and apologize, right? Right now, we're at war in half a dozen countries. We're supporting the Saudis in Yemen, carrying it out. I was in Yemen. It was a gorgeous country. A devastating war against defenseless people because Saudi Arabia is our ally and so forth. You know, the kinds of things that people do, Israel against Palestinians, Armenians in 1915 against Armenians. I wrote a book on it, and I still don't quite understand how these things happen. Maybe this is beyond the powers of simple historians. Maybe you need a Tolstoy or a Dostoevsky to understand such things. Yeah.
Your comments about empathy raise an obvious question for me. How would you compare Stalin with the other great dictator murderers of the 20th century, with Hitler, with Mao, with Pol Pot?
They're comparable. They're comparable, of course, but very often, in recent years particularly, people have argued that Stalin was worse than Hitler, right? Worse than Hitler. Because if you go up to 1939, 1941, Stalin has killed more people, his own citizens, than Hitler. So you have the Night of the Long Knives, you have Kristallnacht and so forth, but you don't have mass killing. Oh, you're starting, you know, handicapped people, some others are being killed, but the great mass killing of the Nazi years is in the Holocaust and in the starving of 2 million Soviet prisoners and all those the kinds of atrocities that took place during the war, with the idea of cleansing Eastern Europe so you could populate it with Aryans and so forth, right? But I would say, you know, if you're playing a numbers game, Mao is certainly up there as well. Certainly Pol Pot is up there. Many things were done by the left and by the right, by the way. Look at Indonesia, mass killing of 500,000 communists or alleged communists by a right-wing military regime, and we have other examples like that, Saddam Hussein and so forth. But you could say that it's Hitler who starts the Second World War, not Stalin. It's Hitler who carries out, who launches a war that kills some tens of millions, 60 million, I don't remember the exact figure in that war. So I'd put Hitler as number one. I saw someone way in the back.
My question is about seminary years. Did Stalin leave, or was he banished? If he was, why was he banished? Was it reading material that fed free thinking? And who was in charge of it?
Yes. So originally, his own mother said, other people said, and sometimes Stalin said he was thrown out of the seminary. The evidence now is that he wasn't thrown out, that he simply increasingly became alienated from the seminary, and you can see it in his grades as well as you go through, and that he finally didn't sit for the final exams, and so he was out. And he had by that time moved away. He was already part of these circles that were reading the non-legitimate literature and forming these little groups and publishing little handwritten journals, etc. In other words, for many of these Russian and Georgian students in the empire, in the Tsarist Empire, they had a counter-education. They had their own alternative education based on reading Russian and Georgian literature and foreign texts and socialist tracts, etc. So he moved that way. In charge of the seminary was the Russian church. The Georgian church, which was an independent Orthodox church, had been abolished as an independent church and joined to the Russian church under the authority of the Holy Synod in Petersburg shortly after Georgia was annexed into Russia in the early 19th century. So the church was dominated by the Russians, and since in the late 19th century and early 20th century, Russia itself was becoming more nationalistic, more sort of Russian national, the church itself was being Russified by these Russian leaders of that church. Here, yeah.
Did Stalin ever directly comment or get involved in the Armenian Holocaust from, what, 15 to 17?
There's no connection there, that he must have known about it, but he was in Siberia at the time, and so I've never seen any evidence that he knew about, that he said anything about it as well, yeah. Yeah, but there were, after World War II, there were claims by the Soviets that they wanted territory in Turkey that had been part of the Russian Empire and had been populated by Armenians, Kars and Ardahan. And he kept that up for a while. Then he said they were really Georgian territories, and then he died, and the Soviets gave up those claims. So nothing else came, yeah.
I'm just thinking about your idea of the erosion of empathy, and I may have misunderstood, but 32, his wife kills herself, and he's devastated. And then 34, his young friend is killed, and he's devastated. And he said that kind of set off the purges, right? So is that not like a deep empathy?
There were people he liked and loved, and lots of people that he loved who he then killed, including members of Nadia's family later, right? Favorite aunt and so forth. So this is a complex figure. Obviously, there were things he liked. He liked drinking parties late at night. He liked to have people around him dancing and singing sometimes. But the people who were closest to him, people like Khrushchev in his memoirs, or Mikoyan in his memoirs, or Molotov, were scared to death that he might turn against them at any time, particularly late in his life, because he seems to have had a number of strokes after the war and lost capacities of various kinds. So there was tremendous fear on the part of even his closest circle to what he might do, because he was so arbitrary. And he had killed people with whom he had once been very close. And there's no pattern in who he executes and doesn't execute. It's very hard to say. Yeah.
So you're talking about extraordinary levels of stress, strokes, some alcohol. Are there health considerations that we should think about? Alcohol, drugs, sleep deprivation?
He never was alcoholic or anything, but he drank, but he usually in moderation. And in Georgian culture, drinking is very big in Georgian culture, as it is in Russian culture. But in Georgian culture, you must be restrained and hold your liquor. And the problem with his father was, his father couldn't do that. His father was deeply alcoholic, which showed weakness, right? Whereas his mother was very strong and disciplined, so he identified with her. There were health problems. He seemed to have suffered from a number of things. He had a withered arm. He had suffered from a carriage accident early in his life. Two carriage accidents. But he also had a very sturdy constitution, and he lasted well into his 70s, which I think is now very young. See, I'm about to I'm in my 70s, but anyway, yeah. Here first and then there.
Is it too simplistic to describe him as a loner?
He was certainly lonely and lost those people very close to him. And I know that every time there's a mass shooting in America, they always say, well, he was a nice fellow, but he was a loner, right? This was not a nice fellow, but he may have been a loner. Yeah. Yeah.
When the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin went on the radio and gave a speech that, well, I wanted to get your evaluation of that speech. I believe it was Volkov who said it inspired Russians to stay in Moscow and not retreat.
When Hitler was organizing the invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa, Stalin had lots of evidence and intelligence that the attack was about to begin. They even had the date of the attacks, June 22nd, 1941. And he ignored it. And he had convinced himself that Hitler would not attack until they had defeated Britain. So he wouldn't try a war on two fronts. Right. So he ignored that. and then the attack occurred. And Stalin went deeply into a kind of funk, into a kind of depression. He withdrew and didn't communicate. And eventually, and Mikoyan tells us in his memoirs, they went from Moscow to his dacha, his summer home, and confronted him. And when he saw them coming, he thought they were coming to arrest him because he had not acted. Several days had gone by, and orders weren't being given, etc. And eventually, no, they said, we want you to be Supreme Commander and Commander-in-Chief. And then he took over and recovered. The first speeches after the invasion were made by others, like Molotov and so forth, not by Stalin. And only a week or so later, I don't remember the exact date, Stalin finally got on the radio, and his very thick Georgian accent said, you know, bratsi siostri, brothers and sisters. And he talked about them very intimately. And that was inspirational. And of course, in October, when there was in fact a threat to Moscow, and the plane was ready for Stalin to be evacuated to the Volga city of Kuybyshev, he stayed in the city as an example, and in fact, defended the city. Thank you so much. This was really fun.